My family spoke French at dinner, so I wouldn't understand their insults. She looks like a pig today, my sister giggled. I ate silently. When the waiter came with the $800 bill, I stood up and said in perfect, fluent French, "My family is paying for everyone in the restaurant tonight." Then I walked out as the waiter cheered. I'm Athena Somerville, 29 years old. This is the story of a $15,000 dinner that my family will never forget, and the moment I finally responded in their own language, fluently, perfectly, and devastatingly. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. To understand what happened at Le Bernardin, you need to understand how I became the outsider in my own family. My mother, Eleanor Parker, divorced my biological father when I was 8 years old. He was a high school history teacher in New Jersey, a good man who loved books more than money, and taught me that knowledge was the only thing no one could ever take from you. He passed away from a heart attack when I was 19, 2 weeks before my college graduation. He never saw me walk across that stage. 6 years after the divorce, when I was 14, my mother remarried. Richard Somerville was everything my father wasn't: wealthy, connected, and obsessed with status. He owned 4 upscale French restaurants across New York and New Jersey. His family traced their roots to Montreal, and he wore his French-Canadian heritage like a designer label. Richard had a daughter from his first marriage. Vivienne was 17 when our parents married, 3 years older than me, and already fluent in French from summers spent with her grandmother in Quebec. She had the Somerville name, the Somerville money, and the Somerville approval. I had none of those things. From the very first dinner, Richard made the hierarchy clear. He spoke to my mother in English, but the moment Vivienne entered the room, they switched to French. Inside jokes, family stories, vacation plans, all conducted in a language I didn't speak. I still remember the first time I asked what they were talking about. Vivienne smiled sweetly. Adult stuff. You wouldn't understand. She was 17. I was 14. But somehow, I was the child who didn't belong. That first night, after everyone went to bed, I heard Richard say something to my mother in French. I caught my name, Athena, and saw my mother's smile falter for just a moment before she laughed along with whatever he'd said. She didn't speak French either, but she never asked him to translate. That was the night I made a decision that would change everything. The French lessons started 2 years later, when I was 16. Not from my family, they never offered. I found a free online course through a community college database and spent every night after homework with headphones plugged in, mimicking pronunciation until my jaw ached. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, who had stopped asking about my day. Not my best friend, who wouldn't have understood why it mattered. And certainly not Richard or Vivienne, who would have found some way to turn it into another joke at my expense. By then, the dinner table had become a battlefield I couldn't fight on. Every Sunday, Richard insisted on family dinner, a 3-hour affair where he held court at the head of the table, Vivienne at his right hand, and my mother desperately trying to keep up with conversations she couldn't follow. I sat at the opposite end, eating in silence, invisible. The insults started small. Sa robe est tellement ordinaire. Her dress is so plain. Elle mange comme si elle n'avait jamais vu de nourriture. She eats like she's never seen food before. Pourquoi Eleanor l'a-t-elle amenée? Elle gâche l'ambiance. Why did Eleanor bring her? She ruins the mood. I heard every word, and I said nothing. By the time I was 18, my French had reached intermediate level. By 20, I was fluent. By 22, I had passed the C1 certification exam with the highest score in my testing group. But I never let them know. Call it strategy. Call it self-preservation. Call it the quiet rebellion of a girl who had been dismissed so many times that she learned to make her invisibility into a weapon. Every insult they whispered became data. Every cruel joke became evidence. Every time they laughed at me in French, I filed it away in a mental folder labeled "Someday." I didn't know when that someday would come, but I knew it would. The cruelest part wasn't the insults, It was the erasure. When I graduated from Columbia University with honors in linguistics, my family didn't attend. Richard had a business dinner. Vivian had a migraine. My mother sent flowers with a card that said, "Sorry we couldn't make it. So proud of you." She spelled my name wrong. Athenia. 2 years later, when I was accepted into the United Nations Interpreter Training Program, one of the most competitive programs in the world, with an acceptance rate of 3%, I made the mistake of sharing the news at Thanksgiving dinner. Richard barely looked up from his turkey. "So you'll be a translator? Like a secretary who speaks other languages?" Vivian laughed. "At least she'll have a job, Papa. That's more than we expected." My mother said nothing. I didn't bother explaining that UN interpreters work with heads of state, that we translate real-time in high-stakes negotiations, that fluency in 6 languages required more skill than anything Richard had ever done in his restaurant empire. I knew they wouldn't hear me. Meanwhile, Vivian's accomplishments were celebrated like national holidays. Her promotion to marketing director at Somerville Hospitality Group, a position created specifically for her, requiring no interview and no competition, warranted a champagne toast. Her Instagram following hitting 40,000 deserved a family dinner in her honor. She was 32 years old and had never held a job her father didn't give her. I was 29 and had interpreted for 3 presidents, 2 prime ministers, and the Secretary General of the United Nations. But in the Somerville household, I was still Eleanor's daughter, the inconvenient reminder of a life my mother had tried to leave behind. What they didn't know was that my secretary job paid $98,000 a year. What they didn't know was that my French had been called impeccable by the French ambassador himself. What they didn't know was that I was about to get a promotion that would change everything. The night before my grandmother's birthday dinner, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my Brooklyn apartment, a 1-bedroom in Park Slope that I'd saved 3 years to afford, and stared at the ceiling, running through every possible scenario for the next evening. My therapist, Dr. Reeves, had a name for what I was doing. Anticipatory anxiety, she called it. Your nervous system preparing for a threat it's learned to expect. The threat was simple: being invisible, being mocked, being reminded again that I didn't belong in the family my mother had chosen over me. For 15 years, I had absorbed every insult like a sponge. I had smiled through dinners where they laughed at my clothes in French. I had nodded politely when Richard introduced me to business associates as Eleanor's daughter from before, as if I were a piece of furniture from a previous apartment, kept out of obligation rather than affection. And every time I told myself, keep the peace, don't make waves, you're better than this. But here's what no one tells you about keeping the peace. It costs you pieces of yourself. I had turned down a promotion 2 years ago because I was afraid of what Richard would say if I failed. See? She's not a real Somerville. She couldn't handle the pressure. I had stopped dating because Vivian's comments about my weight, "Elle ne trouvera jamais de mari avec ce corps," had burrowed so deep that I couldn't look at myself without hearing them. I had called my mother less and less because every conversation somehow circled back to Richard's restaurants, Vivian's social life, the vacation house in the Hamptons that I was never invited to use. That night, lying in the dark, I finally asked myself the question I'd been avoiding for 15 years. If I keep silent forever, what will I have left? The answer came immediately, cold and clear. Nothing. I would have nothing. Not my dignity, not my self-respect, not even the relationship with my mother, which had already withered into something I barely recognized. 15 years of data, 15 years of insults, 15 years of being erased. Something had to change. I didn't know it yet, but the change was already coming, in the form of an email that would arrive in 36 hours, and a dinner that would cost my stepfather far more than he ever anticipated. The invitation came 2 weeks before the dinner, buried in a group email from my mother. Family! Richard has reserved a private table at Le Bernardin for Mom's 60th birthday. Saturday, March 15th, 7 p.m. Please confirm attendance. Dress code, elegant. Le Bernardin, 3 Michelin stars, A tasting menu that started at $400 per person, Richard's favorite restaurant, and more importantly, his favorite stage. I knew exactly why he'd chosen it. Le Bernardin wasn't just a restaurant to Richard. It was a temple where he worshipped at the altar of his own success. He'd been photographed there for a local business magazine. He had the maitre d's personal number in his phone. This dinner wasn't about my grandmother's birthday. It was about Richard performing generosity for an audience of 23 family members and whoever else happened to be watching. My finger hovered over the decline button for a long moment. Then my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Athena, please come. It would mean so much to Grandma. You know she asks about you." Grandma Dorothy. The only person in my family who had never made me feel invisible. She didn't speak French, never had, never would. But she had a way of looking at me during those awful dinners, her eyes soft with something that might have been understanding. Once, when I was 16 and fighting tears after a particularly vicious round of French insults, she had squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "You're stronger than all of them, sweetheart. Don't let them see you break." I never forgot that. For Grandma Dorothy, I typed back, "I'll be there." My mother's response was immediate. "Wonderful. Remember to dress nicely. Richard doesn't want anyone embarrassing him." Anyone. She meant me. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my email app and began composing a message I would never send. A list of every French insult I had catalogued over 15 years, translated into English, with dates and witnesses. It stretched to 4 pages. I stared at it for a long time. Then I saved it to drafts and closed my laptop. I didn't know what I was going to do at that dinner. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done being invisible. The countdown to March 15th had begun. Le Bernardin glowed like a jewel box against the gray Manhattan evening. I arrived at exactly 7 p.m. on Saturday, March 15th, 2025. Not early enough to seem eager, not late enough to give Richard an excuse to comment. The navy blue cocktail dress I'd chosen was simple, elegant, and deliberately unremarkable. I didn't want to give anyone ammunition. The hostess led me through the dining room, past tables of well-dressed couples and business groups speaking in hushed, important tones. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over white tablecloths. The air smelled of butter, wine, and money. Our table was impossible to miss. Richard had claimed the head of a long table that seated 24, positioned in the center of the room like a throne. He wore a charcoal suit and a silk tie that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Vivian sat at his right hand in a red Valentino dress, her phone already out, angling for the perfect selfie. 21 other family members filled the remaining seats, aunts, uncles, cousins I barely knew, and my grandmother Dorothy, who looked small and slightly overwhelmed in a lavender cardigan. My mother spotted me first. "Athena, you made it!" Her voice was bright, performative, the voice she used when she wanted Richard to see what a good mother she was. Richard glanced up, his expression flickering from recognition to something cooler. "Athena, glad you could join us." He gestured to an empty chair at the far end of the table, the furthest possible seat from him, my mother, and Vivian. "We've already ordered for the table, the prefix menu. I hope that's acceptable." It wasn't a question. "Of course," I said. "Thank you for the invitation." I sat down, arranged my napkin, and waited. The real performance was about to begin. The first insult came before I'd even finished my water. Vivian leaned toward Richard, her voice carrying just enough to reach those of us at her end of the table, but pitched low enough to seem private. She spoke in French, rapid and casual, the way you might discuss the weather. "Papa, regarde sa robe. On dirait qu'elle l'a achetée chez Target." "Dad, look at her dress. It looks like she bought it at Target." Richard chuckled, swirling his wine. "Au moins elle est venue. Eleanor serait furieuse sinon." At least she came. Eleanor would be furious otherwise. My mother, seated between them, smiled vaguely. She couldn't understand French, but she'd learned over 18 years, that the safest response was agreement. Always agreement. I cut a piece of bread, buttered it slowly, and said nothing. Across the table, my cousin Marcus, who didn't speak French either, gave me a sympathetic look. He'd witnessed enough of these dinners to understand the general dynamic, even if he couldn't translate the specifics. Vivienne caught his glance and smirked. Elle ne remarque même pas qu'on parle d'elle, comme un chien sourd. She doesn't even notice we're talking about her. Like a deaf dog. I noticed. I always noticed. But I had learned long ago that reacting only made it worse. Richard fed on reactions, on the power of making someone squirm while pretending innocence. If I confronted them, I would be the sensitive one, the troublemaker, the person who couldn't take a joke. So I chewed my bread, sipped my water, and added 2 more entries to the mental file. Deaf dog. Target dress. The file was getting thick, and the night was just beginning. By the time the main course arrived, the insults had escalated. I had ordered the filet, a beautiful piece of beef that arrived pink and perfect on a white plate. Vivienne's eyes tracked from my plate to my face, and something cruel flickered in her expression. She turned to her grandmother, Richard's mother, a sharp-featured woman named Marguerite, who spoke French as naturally as breathing, and pitched her voice to Carrie. Elle mange comme un cochon et ressemble à un cochon. Pas étonnant qu'elle soit toujours célibataire. She eats like a pig and looks like a pig. No wonder she's still single. Marguerite laughed, the sound thin and mean. Richard added his contribution, not even bothering to lower his voice. Le père biologique était aussi un raté, c'est génétique. The biological father was also a loser. It's genetic. My knife stopped halfway through the meat. They were talking about my father. My father who had worked 60-hour weeks to pay for my education. My father who had read me bedtime stories in funny voices until I was too old to admit I still loved them. My father who had died before he could see me become everything he'd believed I could be. I set down my knife, then my fork. I placed my hands flat on the tablecloth and took a slow breath. My mother was staring at her plate, her cheeks flushed. She understood enough. She understood Athena and pear and the tone of casual contempt. She knew, and she said nothing. Grandma Dorothy caught my eye from 3 seats away. Her brow was furrowed with concern. She couldn't understand the words, but she could read the room. I gave her a small nod. I'm okay. But I wasn't okay. Something inside me had shifted. This was the line. In my profession, timing is everything. When you're interpreting for the Security Council, you learn to read the room with surgical precision. You learn when to speak and when to wait, when to translate a pause and when to let silence do the work. You learn that the most powerful response is often the one that comes exactly when no one expects it. Richard was building to something. I could see it in the way he performed for the tables around us, ordering a 4th bottle of wine, speaking louder about his hospitality empire, making sure everyone within earshot knew he was paying for all of this. He wanted an audience for his generosity. I decided to give him one, but not yet. Not while he still controlled the narrative. I forced myself to eat, to smile at my cousin Marcus when he made a joke, to compliment my grandmother on her cardigan. Normal. Invisible. Exactly what they expected. Meanwhile, I took inventory. The restaurant was full. Easily 80 patrons at the surrounding tables. I recognized the type. Upper East Side regulars, expense account executives, a few couples celebrating anniversaries. There were also 2 women at a corner table who had been photographing their food with professional precision. Food bloggers, probably, or critics. And there, moving between tables with quiet authority, was a face I recognized. Marc Dubois, general manager of Le Bernardin. 45 years old, born in Lyon, former amateur interpreter for the French diplomatic corps before pivoting to hospitality. We had spoken at a French embassy reception 8 months ago, entirely in French, for 20 minutes. He hadn't noticed me yet. But he would. The check would come eventually. And when it did, I would be ready. The only question was how far Richard would push before then. 2 days before this dinner, I had received an email that changed everything. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone, not because I was keeping it secret, but because no one in my family had bothered to ask how I was doing. Not in years. The email came from UN Human Resources at 3:47 p.m. on Thursday, March 13th. Subject line: Promotion Notification, Lead Interpreter, Security Council. I still remembered reading it 3 times before the words sank in. Dear Ms. Somerville, we are pleased to inform you that effective April 1st, 2025, you will assume the position of lead interpreter for the United Nations Security Council. This role carries an annual salary of $127,000 USD and reflects our recognition of your exceptional linguistic capabilities, particularly your fluency in French, Arabic, Spanish, Mandarin, Russian, and English. Your performance over the past 5 years has been exemplary. The Secretary General's office has specifically noted your precision under pressure and your ability to navigate sensitive diplomatic communications with professionalism and grace. We look forward to your continued service. Regards, Office of Human Resources, United Nations Headquarters. Lead Interpreter, the highest position in my field at the UN. A $29,000 raise. Official recognition that my French, the language my family used to mock me, was considered exceptional by people who actually mattered. I had saved the email to my phone. Not to show anyone, I wasn't planning some dramatic revelation. I saved it the way you might save a photograph of something precious. Proof that it really happened. Proof that I wasn't what they said I was. Now, sitting at the far end of Richard's table, watching him preen for his audience, I felt the weight of that email in my pocket like a talisman. They thought I was worthless. They were about to learn otherwise. I noticed Marc Dubois before he noticed me. He was making his rounds through the dining room, adjusting a wineglass here, murmuring to a waiter there, doing the invisible work of a man who ran a 3 Michelin-star operation. His suit was impeccable, his posture perfect, his attention divided among 50 things at once. Then his gaze swept across our table, and I saw the moment recognition flickered in his eyes. He knew me. I could tell by the subtle pause, the slight tilt of his head. 8 months ago, at a reception for the new French ambassador, we had ended up in the same conversation circle. Someone had introduced me as a UN interpreter, and Marc, discovering I was fluent in French, had abandoned English entirely for the rest of the evening. Votre accent est remarquable, he'd said, genuinely impressed. More Parisian than most Parisians I know. Where did you study? I had told him the truth. Mostly self-taught, with years of practice at the UN. He'd been charmed by that, a working-class success story in a room full of inherited advantage. Now, across the crowded restaurant, Marc gave me the smallest nod of acknowledgement before continuing his rounds. Professional, discreet, but unmistakably aware of who I was and what I could do. I hadn't planned for this. I hadn't even known he still worked here. But something about his presence felt like a sign, like the universe placing a witness exactly where I needed one. Richard, meanwhile, was loudly explaining to the table that he knew the whole management team at Le Bernardin. They treat us like family here, he boasted. He had no idea that the general manager had just silently acknowledged his stepdaughter as the more impressive person at the table. The irony was almost too perfect. By 8:30 p.m., Richard had consumed enough wine to reach his favorite state, magnanimously superior. He pushed back from the table, champagne flute in hand, and cleared his throat with the theatrical gravity of a man about to deliver a commencement address. If I could have everyone's attention. The conversations died down. 23 faces turned toward him, family members, yes, but also nearby diners who had been drawn by his volume all evening. Richard noticed the expanded audience and smiled wider. Tonight we celebrate a very special woman. Dorothy, my wonderful mother-in-law, turned 60 years young. And what better way to honor her than here, at one of the finest restaurants in the world, surrounded by the people who love her. He paused for effect. The Somerville family has always believed in excellence, in hard work, in building something from nothing. I almost laughed. Richard had inherited his first restaurant from his father and had never worked a service shift in his life. Tonight, I'm proud to host all of you, to share this meal, this moment, this celebration of everything our family represents. He raised his glass. To Dorothy, to family, to the Somerville legacy. To the Somerville legacy, the table echoed. I lifted my water glass a fraction and said nothing. Richard hadn't mentioned Grandma Dorothy's actual accomplishments. Her 40 years as a nurse, her volunteer work, the way she'd raised 3 children alone after her husband passed. He hadn't mentioned my mother's contributions either, or mine, or anyone's beyond his own carefully curated mythology. This toast wasn't about my grandmother. It was about Richard reminding everyone who paid for dinner, who controlled the room, who mattered. At a nearby table, I noticed one of the food bloggers discreetly recording on her phone. The other was typing something, probably a tweet about the spectacle. Richard had wanted an audience. He was about to get more than he bargained for. The toast had barely finished when Richard returned to his seat and switched back to French. This time, he didn't even pretend to keep his voice down. Au fait, he said to Vivienne, reaching for the wine. J'ai décidé de donner la maison des Hamptons à toi. Athena n'a pas besoin de rien de nous. Elle n'est pas vraiment une Somerville de toute façon. By the way, I've decided to give you the Hamptons house. Athena doesn't need anything from us. She's not really a Somerville anyway. Vivian's face lit up. Parfait, papa. Elle peut continuer à vivre dans son petit appartement minable à Brooklyn. Perfect, Dad. She can keep living in her sad little apartment in Brooklyn. Richard laughed. Au moins, elle ne nous embarrassera pas devant nos vrais amis. Tu imagines si elle essayait de parler à nos partenaires commerciaux? Bonjour, je suis la traductrice. At least she won't embarrass us in front of our real friends. Can you imagine if she tried to speak to our business partners? Hello, I'm the translator. He said the last word in a mocking falsetto, and Vivian nearly choked on her champagne laughing. My mother's face had gone pale. She understood enough, the names, the laughter, the glances in my direction. She knew something cruel was being said, but she stared at her plate, silent, complicit in her cowardice. I looked down the table at Grandma Dorothy. She was watching Richard with an expression I'd never seen before. Not confusion, not sadness, but something harder. Disappointment, maybe, or recognition of exactly what kind of man her daughter had married. Our eyes met. Something passed between us in that moment, an understanding that transcended language. She couldn't help me. She was too old, too tired, too dependent on Eleanor's goodwill. But she was with me. I gave her a small nod. Then I set down my napkin and waited. The check would come soon, and when it did, 15 years of silence would finally end. At 9:47 p.m., Marc Dubois approached our table personally. In a restaurant like Le Bernardin, the general manager doesn't usually deliver checks. That task falls to waiters, captains, maitre d's. But this was Richard's table, a 24-person reservation at the center of the dining room, racking up a bill that would probably make the highlight reel of the week. Mark carried the leather bill folder with the quiet dignity of a man presenting a wine list. Monsieur Somerville, he said smoothly, I trust everything was to your satisfaction this evening? Richard preened. Exceptional as always, Mark. You run a magnificent establishment. You're too kind. Mark set the folder at Richard's elbow. Whenever you're ready, of course. Richard opened the folder with a flourish, then paused. I couldn't see the number from my seat, but I watched his eyebrows lift a fraction before he composed himself. The price of 4 bottles of wine, a private dining arrangement, and 23 prix-fixe menus at $450 each had apparently exceeded even his expectations. But he was Richard Somerville. He didn't flinch at checks in public. Perfect, he said, reaching for his wallet. That's when I stood up. Every head at the table turned toward me. Richard's hand froze halfway to his pocket. Vivian's smirk faltered into confusion. Qu'est-ce qu'elle fait? She whispered to Richard. What's she doing? I smoothed my dress. I took a breath. And for the first time in 15 years, I opened my mouth to speak French. Not the hesitant, nervous French of a tourist asking for directions. Not the careful French of a student reciting from a textbook. The French I spoke next was flawless, Parisian, precise. The French of a woman who had been listening and waiting for a very long time. This is the moment everything changed. But before I continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated by people who assumed you couldn't understand them? Have you ever been mocked by someone who thought you didn't know? Tell me your story in the comments. Let me know I'm not alone. And if you're as invested in this moment as I was, hit that like button. Let me know you're still with me. Excusez-moi, Monsieur Dubois. My voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade. Mark turned, his professional composure flickering with surprise, as perfect French poured from a woman he'd assumed was the quiet guest at the far end of the table. Ma famille a exprimé ce soir leur générosité exceptionnelle, I continued smoothly. Ils souhaitent offrir le dîner à toutes les tables autour de nous, en guise de célébration de l'anniversaire de ma grand-mère. My family has expressed exceptional generosity tonight. They wish to offer dinner to all the tables around us, as a celebration of my grandmother's birthday. I turned to Richard, letting my gaze settle on him with 15 years of patience behind it. N'est-ce pas, Richard? Isn't that right, Richard? The silence that followed was profound. Richard's face had gone white. His hand, still halfway to his wallet, trembled visibly. Across from him, Vivian's mouth hung open, her perfectly glossed lips forming a small O of horror. Marc Dubois recovered first. His eyes met mine and I saw recognition sharpen into something like admiration. Mademoiselle Somerville, he said warmly, his French switching to match my Parisian cadence. Quel plaisir de vous revoir. Votre français est toujours aussi impeccable. What a pleasure to see you again. Your French is still impeccable. I inclined my head graciously. Merci, Monsieur Dubois. J'ai eu d'excellents professeurs à l'ONU. Thank you, Mr. Dubois. I've had excellent teachers at the UN. The mention of the United Nations landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spread across the table. Confused glances, whispered questions, the dawning realization that something very wrong had just happened to Richard's carefully constructed narrative. I turned to face my stepfather fully. 15 years, Richard. Every word. I understood every single word. Richard's composure crumbled in stages. First came denial, a forced laugh, too sharp, too loud. Athena, this is ridiculous. You don't speak. Cochon, I interrupted quietly. That's what Vivienne called me tonight. Twice. Elle ressemble à un cochon. Elle mange comme un cochon. Vivienne made a strangled sound. And you, Richard, you said my father was un raté, a loser, that it was genetic, that I wasn't a real Somerville. I paused, letting each word sink in. Shall I continue? I have 15 years of material. The color drained from Richard's face so completely that I thought for a moment he might faint. Around us, family members were staring, some in confusion, some in horror, some with the dawning recognition of people who had witnessed enough to piece together what had just been revealed. Vivian's voice came out as a whisper. Tu savais? Tout ce temps? You knew? All this time? I answered in English, loud enough for everyone, including the nearby tables, including the food bloggers with their phones, to hear. Every time you called me fat, every time you mocked my clothes, every time you laughed about my father, my apartment, my career. I kept my voice steady, professional, the same tone I used when translating during tense negotiations. I remember all of it, Vivian, every single word. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. My mother had covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling in her eyes. Whether from shame or shock, I couldn't tell. I wasn't sure I cared. Marc Dubois stood quietly to the side, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with interest. He had witnessed everything, and he wasn't the only one. The tables around us had gone very, very quiet. Marc Dubois, consummate professional that he was, moved to confirm my offer. "Shall I extend your family's generosity to the surrounding tables, Monsieur Somerville?" His voice was perfectly pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "It's a lovely gesture for a birthday celebration." Richard's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He was trapped and he knew it. Refusing now would mean admitting, publicly, that his stepdaughter had outmaneuvered him. It would mean acknowledging that the family generosity he'd been performing all night was just performance, that he wasn't actually the magnanimous patriarch he'd pretended to be. In front of 80-plus diners, in front of the restaurant staff he'd bragged about knowing, in front of his own family members, who were now looking at him with expressions ranging from confusion to barely suppressed satisfaction. "Of course," he managed, his voice hoarse. Happy to extend the celebration." Mark nodded smoothly. "Very generous, sir. I'll inform the other tables." He moved away, and within moments I could hear the murmurs spreading. "The gentleman at the center table. Paying for everyone. Birthday celebration." A woman at a nearby table actually stood up to raise her glass toward us. "How wonderful! Thank you so much." Her dining companion began to applaud, and the sound rippled outward. Other tables joined in. Genuine, delighted applause for Richard Somerville's unexpected generosity. Richard sat frozen, his face a mask of controlled fury. I had just added approximately $10,000 to his evening. More importantly, I had done it using the exact tactics he'd used to humiliate me for 15 years. Public performance, social pressure, and the weaponization of witnesses. The irony wasn't lost on him. His hands were shaking as he reached for his wine. I didn't linger for the finale. I walked to Grandma Dorothy first. She was crying, quiet tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, but when I bent to kiss her forehead, she grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "So proud." I squeezed her fingers gently. "Happy birthday, Grandma. I love you." Then I turned to my mother. Eleanor looked shattered. Her mascara had smeared, her careful composure completely gone. She reached toward me, her mouth forming words that wouldn't come. I spoke before she could find them. "Mom, when you're ready to have a real conversation, an honest one, you know my number." I didn't wait for her response. I collected my clutch from my chair, smoothed my navy dress, and began walking toward the exit. I kept my pace measured, my spine straight. Not running, not triumphant, simply finished. As I passed the surrounding tables, the ones that Richard was now involuntarily treating to dinner, a few patrons caught my eye. Some nodded with quiet approval. One woman mouthed, "Good for you." Near the door, Marc Dubois appeared at my elbow. "Mademoiselle Somerville." His voice was low, just for me. "That was the most remarkable thing I've witnessed in 20 years of hospitality." I allowed myself a small smile. "Merci, Monsieur Dubois. I apologize for any disruption to your evening." He shook his head. "No apology necessary. Some people deserve exactly what they receive." I stepped out into the March night, the cold Manhattan air hitting my face like a blessing. Behind me, through the glass doors, I could see Richard still sitting at that table, surrounded by family members who now knew exactly what kind of man he was. I didn't look back. My phone exploded before I reached the subway. By the time I unlocked my apartment door in Brooklyn at 10:47 p.m., I had accumulated 17 missed calls, 23 text messages, and 4 voicemails. I set my clutch on the kitchen counter, made a cup of chamomile tea, and sat down to review the damage. Richard had texted twice. The first message arrived at 10:02 p.m. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone. This is absolutely unforgivable. Don't expect to be welcome at any family event ever again." The second came 12 minutes later. "That dinner cost me over $24,000 because of your little stunt. You will be hearing from my lawyer." I screenshotted both messages and saved them to a folder labeled Documentation. Vivian's approach was different. 3 texts in rapid succession, each one a masterclass in deflection. Athena, we need to talk. I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. I would never say those things seriously. It was just family jokes. You know how we tease each other. Call me back. We can work this out. We're sisters. We had never been sisters. Not once in 18 years. My mother's messages were the hardest to read. Walls of text full of I didn't know and I'm so sorry and please call me, please, I need to explain. There was nothing to explain. She had sat at that table for 15 years and chosen silence every single time. I turned off my phone, finished my tea, and sat by the window watching the Brooklyn lights twinkle in the darkness. For the first time in 15 years, I felt something I barely recognized. Peace. Not happiness, not yet. But the bone-deep relief of a woman who had finally stopped carrying a weight she was never meant to bear. The internet moves faster than family drama. By noon the next day, the story had escaped. One of the food bloggers from Le Bernardin, a woman with 89,000 Twitter followers named @NYC Foodie Emma, had posted a thread at 11:34 p.m. the night before. Y'all, I just witnessed the most incredible thing at Le Bernardin. A family was roasting this woman in French right in front of her all night, calling her a pig, mocking her clothes, laughing at her. They thought she couldn't understand. Turns out she's a UN interpreter who speaks 6 languages, including French. She made them pay for the entire restaurant. I am deceased. By morning, the thread had 14,000 likes and 3,200 retweets. The replies were a mix of queen behavior and this is the content I'm here for, and I need a movie about this woman immediately. Someone tagged a viral content aggregator. By afternoon, the story had been picked up by Bored Panda, shared in a Reddit thread titled Most Satisfying Revenge Stories, and referenced in 2 TikTok videos. No one named the family directly. But New York's restaurant industry is small, and Richard Somerville was not unknown. A colleague from the UN sent me a text with a screenshot of the thread. Athena, is this you? If so, I'm buying you a drink. I didn't confirm or deny, but I saved the screenshot to the same folder as Richard's threatening texts. Documentation. You never know when you'll need proof that you were the one who was wronged. Richard's lawyer never called. I suspect someone advised him that threatening legal action against a woman for making him honor his own public offer of generosity would not play well, especially with a viral thread already circulating and witnesses willing to testify that his family had spent the evening mocking said woman in a language they assumed she couldn't understand. There was no lawsuit, no demand for reimbursement, just silence from Richard and Vivian, broken only by increasingly desperate texts that I continued to ignore. I didn't want their money. I didn't want the Hamptons house or the inheritance or any of the Somerville assets they dangled as proof of my unworthiness. I wanted exactly one thing, and I had taken it for myself: the right to be treated with basic human dignity. The only action I took was practical. On the Monday after the dinner, I blocked Richard's and Vivian's numbers. Not permanently. I wasn't trying to burn bridges that might someday need rebuilding. But for now, indefinitely. I left my mother's number unblocked. That door remained open if she chose to walk through it honestly. My cousin Marcus texted me that week. Hey, just wanted to say I'm sorry I didn't speak up more over the years. I knew something was wrong, even if I didn't know the specifics. You deserved better. I replied, thank you. That means more than you know. Small kindnesses, small acknowledgments. It wasn't the dramatic resolution of a movie, but it was real. And real was enough. The fallout for Richard came in waves. The first hit arrived 10 days after the dinner, in the form of an email he didn't know I knew about. My cousin Marcus forwarded it to me with the subject line, "Thought you should see this." It was a message from a boutique hotel chain that had been in preliminary talks with Somerville Hospitality Group about a restaurant partnership. The hotels wanted upscale dining options for their Manhattan properties. Richard wanted expansion opportunities. The email was polite, professional, and devastating. Dear Mr. Somerville, after careful consideration, we have decided not to move forward with our proposed partnership at this time. Recent concerns about brand alignment have led us to pursue other opportunities. We wish you continued success in your endeavors. Best regards, Harrison Blake, VP of Strategic Partnerships, Metropolitan Boutique Hotels. Brand alignment. Corporate speak for, we heard about what happened at Le Bernardin, and we don't want our name associated with yours. Marcus estimated the lost deal at somewhere between $200,000 and $500,000 annually. 2 weeks later, an article appeared in Eater NY's industry newsletter. Somerville Hospitality Group quietly delays expansion plans. The piece didn't mention the dinner. It didn't have to. In the insular world of New York fine dining, rumors traveled faster than reviews. I didn't celebrate these developments. I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction watching Richard's empire wobble. But I didn't feel sorry for him either. For 15 years, he had treated cruelty as a sport, and my dignity as collateral damage. The universe was simply returning the favor. Not through anything I did, but through the natural consequences of his own behavior finally becoming visible. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Vivienne's fall was quieter, but no less real. Her Instagram, once a carefully curated shrine to the Somerville lifestyle, went silent for 3 weeks after the dinner. When she finally posted again, it was a generic sunset photo with no caption. The comments were split between supportive followers who didn't know what had happened and pointed questions from those who did. Heard you had quite the dinner party recently. Isn't this the girl who got exposed for bullying her stepsister? Karma is real, LOL. She deleted the comments. Then she deleted the post. Then she set her account to private. Within a month, her follower count had dropped from 45,000 to 43,000, a 2,000-person exodus that represented something more significant than numbers. In Vivienne's world, social media following was currency. Losing it meant losing status. More damaging than Instagram, though, was the whisper network. Manhattan's social elite is a small pond, and gossip is its primary ecosystem. The story of Le Bernardin spread through charity boards and country club lunches, through Hampton's weekend gatherings and Upper East Side dinner parties. Vivienne wasn't canceled. She wasn't ostracized. But she was noted, remembered. Oh, Vivienne Somerville? Isn't she the one who... I heard she was calling her stepsister a pig in French. Apparently, the sister works at the UN. 6 languages. Can you imagine? For a woman whose entire identity rested on being seen as elegant, sophisticated, and above reproach, being known as a bully was its own kind of prison. I didn't track these developments obsessively. I had a new job to prepare for, a life to rebuild. But when updates filtered through Marcus or appeared in my social media periphery, I acknowledged them with grim satisfaction. Actions have consequences, even for princesses. My mother called on a Wednesday evening, 3 days after the dinner. I almost didn't answer. My thumb hovered over decline for a long moment before something, muscle memory, or maybe the last stubborn ember of hope, made me swipe green instead. Athena. Her voice was hoarse. She'd been crying. Mom. Silence stretched between us, heavy with 15 years of things left unsaid. Finally, I didn't know. I didn't know they were saying those things. You didn't know the words, I corrected quietly. But you knew something was wrong. You knew I was being excluded. You saw me sitting alone at the end of the table every single time, and you never once asked why. She made a sound, a soft, wounded noise. I was trying to keep the peace. You were trying to keep Richard happy. I cut her off, not with anger, but with the clean precision of a truth too long delayed. And I understand why. I do. He gave you security, status, a life you couldn't have built alone. But the price of that life was me, Mom. You paid for your comfort with my dignity. That's not... It is. And I need you to sit with that before we can move forward. More silence. I could hear her breathing, ragged with suppressed sobs. "What do you want me to do?" she finally asked. "Tell me what to do." "I want you to be honest. With yourself. With me. I want you to stop pretending you didn't see what was happening. And I want you to choose, not between Richard and me, but between the truth and the comfortable lie. I don't know if I can." "Then call me when you figure it out." I hung up before she could respond. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done. On April 1st, 2025, I walked into the United Nations Security Council chamber as lead interpreter for the first time. The room was smaller than most people imagine. A curved table, blue velvet chairs, the famous horseshoe arrangement that had witnessed some of the most consequential discussions in human history. The interpreter's booth overlooked everything, a glass-walled sanctuary where words were transformed and meaning preserved. My first session involved a tense debate between the French and Russian delegations regarding sanctions policy. For 90 minutes, I translated in real time, French to English, English to French, while diplomats argued, negotiated, and occasionally insulted each other in language carefully chosen to be deniable. I caught every nuance, every subtext, every barbed compliment and veiled threat. Afterward, the French ambassador himself stopped by the booth. "Mademoiselle Somerville," he said warmly, "your predecessor spoke highly of you. Now I understand why. Your grasp of our language is exceptional." "Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur," I replied. "C'est un honneur de servir." "It's an honor to serve." He smiled, a genuine smile, from a man who had heard thousands of interpreters over his career, and walked away. That evening, I received a text from Jonathan Hayes, my colleague and friend. "Heard you crushed it today. Congratulations, Led. You've earned this." I sat in my Brooklyn apartment, looking out at the lights of the city, and let myself feel what I'd been too afraid to acknowledge: pride. Not the aggressive pride of proving someone wrong, but the quiet pride of becoming who I was always meant to be. A professional, a linguist, a woman whose value wasn't determined by the people who refused to see it. My new salary was $127,000 a year. More importantly, I had finally stopped asking for permission to exist. You see, sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's waiting for the right moment. If you're in a relationship where you feel dismissed, where your value is invisible, remember this: your worth doesn't depend on whether others see it. You know who you are. Do you agree? Tell me in the comments. And if this story has resonated with you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more stories like this waiting for you. Grandma Dorothy called on a Saturday morning in late April, 5 weeks after the dinner. I was making coffee when my phone lit up with her name, a contact I hadn't seen in months because she preferred handwritten letters and in-person visits to digital communication. "Grandma, is everything okay?" "Everything is wonderful, sweetheart." Her voice was stronger than I expected, almost playful. "I'm calling to invite you to lunch. Just the two of us. No Richard, no Vivian, no drama. Just my favorite granddaughter, and some overpriced salad at that cafe you like in the village." I laughed. Actually laughed, the sound surprising in my quiet apartment. "Your only granddaughter on Mom's side." "Details." I could hear her smiling. "Will you come?" "Of course I'll come." We met at a small bistro on Bleecker Street 2 days later. Grandma Dorothy ordered a Caesar salad and a glass of white wine. I got the soup of the day and sparkling water. For an hour, we talked about everything except the family: her garden, my new position, the mystery novel she was reading, the difficulty of finding comfortable shoes at her age. Finally, over coffee, she reached across the table and took my hand. "I want to thank you," she said quietly, "for what you did at my birthday. Grandma, I'm sorry if I ruined—" "You didn't ruin anything." Her grip tightened. "You showed me something I needed to see, something I'd suspected for years but couldn't prove." She paused. "I'm not a stupid woman, Athena. I knew Richard was unkind. I just didn't know how unkind until you showed everyone, what they'd been hiding behind their precious French. I didn't plan it." "I know. That's what made it honest. She smiled, eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm so proud of you. 6 weeks after Le Bernardin, my mother asked to meet for coffee. I chose a neutral location, a busy Starbucks in Midtown, public enough that neither of us could fall apart, anonymous enough that it wouldn't matter if we did. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with both hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. She looked older than I remembered, thinner, more fragile, the careful polish she'd cultivated over 18 years of Somerville life worn away. Thank you for coming, she said as I sat down. You said you wanted to talk honestly. I'm here. She nodded, took a breath, and began. What followed wasn't the conversation I expected. There was no defense of Richard, no minimization of what had happened. Instead, there was confession. How she'd known, on some level, that I was being mistreated. How she'd convinced herself it was just teasing, just sibling rivalry, just language barrier. How she'd chosen peace over truth because the alternative, confronting Richard, risking the marriage, losing the security she'd fought so hard to build, terrified her more than watching me suffer. I chose wrong, she said finally. I know that now. I chose him over you, and I can never undo that. No, I agreed. You can't. Her face crumpled, but I pressed forward. I'm not asking you to leave Richard, Mom. That's your choice, your life. But if you want a relationship with me, a real one, there are conditions. I laid them out clearly. No more family dinners where I was mocked. No more playing messenger between Richard and me. No more pretending the last 15 years didn't happen. She agreed to everything. Whether she would follow through remained to be seen. But for the first time, I had hope. Cautious, conditional hope. It was a start. 3 months after the dinner, my life looked different. Not dramatic makeover different. Not revenge fantasy complete different. Just healthier. I saw Grandma Dorothy every other Sunday. We had developed a ritual. Brunch at the village bistro, followed by a walk through Washington Square Park if the weather cooperated. She told me stories about my grandfather, about my mother as a child, about the woman she'd been before life taught her to compromise. I talked to my mother once a week. Brief calls, carefully navigated. She was trying. I could hear it in the way she asked about my work, the way she avoided mentioning Richard unless I brought him up first. We weren't healed, but we were healing. I heard nothing from Richard or Vivian. Their numbers remained blocked, their existence filed under "not my responsibility." At work, I was thriving. The Security Council position challenged me in ways I hadn't expected, and I rose to meet each one. In September, I was invited to join a diplomatic delegation to Geneva, a recognition of my skills that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. I had built a life, not because they let me, in spite of them. If you've stayed with me this long, I want to leave you with something. Not advice exactly, more like permission. For 15 years, I believed that keeping the peace meant keeping silent, that enduring insults was the price of belonging, that speaking up would make me the problem instead of the person with the problem. I was wrong. You don't owe your silence to people who use it against you. You don't owe your forgiveness to people who haven't earned it. And you don't owe your presence to tables where you're only welcome as a target. Setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's survival. I didn't destroy my family at that dinner. They had been destroying themselves for years with their casual cruelty. I simply held up a mirror. The reflection wasn't my fault. There's a French phrase I think about often. La vengeance est un plat qui se mange froid. Revenge is a dish best served cold. But I don't call what happened at Le Bernardin revenge. I call it honesty. And honesty, unlike revenge, doesn't leave you empty afterward. It sets you free. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that your voice matters, that your dignity is worth protecting, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Subscribe if you want more stories about strength, boundaries, and the quiet power of knowing your own worth. Check the description for more stories like this one. Until next time.